so we can go ahead and make our object. I'm going to set this to the side and get some of that. All right. So we're going to be using this 100% silicone. It's important that it says 100% silicone on it. It's also important that on the back, you'll read the instructions and it will say on there, acetic acid release during cure, or acetic acid is involved in the curing. What will tend to happen is that when I've taught this before, when I used to teach at glass casting community college, they would get something called like Silicone Plus or Silicone Advance or something. That just means the company added probably latex to it to increase its flexibility or its ability to get into little crevices and things like that. We don't want that. We want 100% silicone, and we want acetic acid involved in the curing process of it. Then we're just going to use some water, just regular water, nothing special. And if you go online, there's tons of videos on how to do this. And the main thing that I see wrong with it is that they add in way too much soap, which isn't necessarily going to harm your mold, but it's completely unnecessary. The other thing is they make their molds way too thick. You have to let air. It needs oxygen. So I usually add about 2 tablespoons or so. You just want to feel it. The water should start getting sudsy. We can go to the overtop. You can see that suds are starting to form in my water. That's what we're looking for. And it should feel a little slick on your fingers. Hands, and then we're going to go ahead and add our silicone. We have our cheapo caulking gun. With these caulking guns often have a opener on the side here. It's a little secret. That takes the tip off, and then if it's a good one, then it has the needle, so you can puncture the interior membrane in there that holds the silicone inside the tube. If you don't puncture that membrane, the silicone comes out of the back of your tube there, which is not fun. So we can go to the overhead. I'm just going to squirt just basically like I'm making noodles or something. I'm not going to try to get it all in one spot. I'm going to move it around. What we're trying to do is coat all of the silicone with the soapy water. And you don't have to unload the whole tube, just enough to get started. Release the pressure on that. Set that aside. And so unfortunately, gloves make this more difficult. If you put on nitrile gloves, the nitrile gloves will tend to stick to the silicone a lot more, unfortunately. One thing that you can help is sometimes I'll put just a little extra soap on my hands to really lubricate my hands to make sure that the silicone doesn't stick, but it really is not as horrible as getting silicone on your hands if you have ever used it to caulk your bathroom or something like that. You can see that it's not sticking, it just falls right off. Can we go to the front view? It just falls right off my hands. It's not sticking at all. And what I'm doing now is just sort of gathering it up, pulling it together into a little nest of silicone, making sure that it's nice and evenly coated. And now I can start to pull it out, make sure both your hands are soapy. And then I'm just going to start almost kneading it. I'm not going to squeeze too hard because the interior of the silicone hasn't been coated with soap, so it's still a little sticky. Even if my hands are coated, it might stick a little bit. So I'm just very lightly sort of moving it back and forth, making sure to get the rest of it. So this process, reasons why you do this is, one, it is cheaper. It ends up being cheaper. You know, a tube of silicone you can sometimes find at some of the like dollar stores or some of the pound stores or whatever sort of cheap store you have for relatively inexpensive. These tubes were $4, and I'm gonna get I think it's like 10 ounces. It's quite a bit of material, especially because we're not making the mold super thick. And you can see now I've pulled off a little bit, and it's just We can go the over. Yeah, we're still on the overhead. I've pulled off a little bit. It's not sticking to my fingers. It's pretty easy to manipulate and I can push it around. And that's really what we're going to be doing. So you can see I can just start manipulating and pushing it around. What you want to do is put it on your object and just start patting it soft. And I want to be able to see my object through. The tutorials I see online that go wrong, it's because they just start glopping a ton of it on there. And that's never going to cure, or it's going to take forever to cure. So it's much better to do it in layers. You know, silicone doesn't like to stick to anything but itself. So if we just start patting on and making a really thin layer, then we can start to capture quite a bit of detail. And because we can push it in to find details of things. You, of course, will not get as fine a detail as you would get by using a pourable silicone like the Smooth On product that I recommended on the supply list. But you can get really good reproduction of simple forms. I've done anywhere from sticks to capturing the text on coffee cup lids, all sorts of different things in order using this process. And it just tends to be a little, I don't want to say it's slower, but you have to do it in layers. So you kind of work on it, step away, come back, and build up all those layers. So I'm just going to keep adding a few more, a little bit more, just going around. And what I'll want to do is eventually cover this whole object, even the base here, because I want to be able to cast that in plaster as well. Side, add a little more silicone. So while I'm doing this, if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, that's totally fine. So you're not just watching me.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So when you're patting it on, just because I can't see the detail of how you're touching it, but
Yeah.
are you suggesting that you're not, I noticed that you're not smoothing it, but it looked like that patting is the way that you connect the layer. Is that right? Like, can you talk about that?
So I'm patting it. See how close I can get without it blurring. So I'm just sort of pushing it in. I'm not smoothing it because that's going to pull it away from the object. Once you have your first layer, then you can kind of do that. But right now I'm just sort of like patting it, just pushing it lightly into the surface.
Thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. It was good to see it up close.
Yeah. So I'm just sort of adding it. And then because silicone, that's not going to stay on. I'll fix that later. So I'm just going to keep adding it, and I want to cover all the things I want to cover in plaster. See, that's what happens. I start talking up something like, I love sticky wax, and then it fails during the demo. That's par for the course. So the tendency is to want to keep going, but I want to make sure that it stays relatively thin, and I'd rather add another layer after this is fully cured in about an hour than wait 24 hours to do a layer. So that's the difference, is if I get it so thick that I can't see my object anymore, I'm probably going to have to wait until the end of the day to do my next layer. But if it's just like this, where I can still see quite a bit of the detail of the object and it's just a really thin skin coat, then this is going to be ready for another layer in about 45 minutes to an hour. And that's much more desirable than than globbing it all on and having it not set. The failures that I've seen is having this mold be too thick, then it feels like it's all set up. It's hard, it's rubbery, and you're so excited, and then you cut it open and the inside just oozes out because it never sets. It does need some oxygen to set, although acetic acid is the main thing. It does need some oxygen and exposure to air in order to fully set. That is one note why this process is people don't like this, is it does smell like vinegar really intensely. if you could transmit smell through Zoom, you'd know what I'm talking about, but it smells like vinegar. I'm just going to set this aside for a second and start to let that set up. So I just want to set that aside, and this is often when in my own studio, when I'm doing this process, is I'll do a layer and then I'll go do a million other things. So it's definitely a multitasking process, glass casting, because there's a lot of waiting. Especially with the silicone mold making process. Clean that up. Do that. So I've got my silicone mold here. It's already started to set up. There's a few areas that are still a little soft, but we can go ahead and move on to the next step and start adding a little bit more. It's a little thin at the top. There are some other areas that are a little thin, but for the most part, it's already starting to come together. Let's see, where's my water? Water. My silicone here. So I can go ahead and add another layer, but there's another way to make a thicker mold a lot quicker, which is to add, I thought I had, I just need like a Ziploc bag. Do you have one? I think I put them in the, yeah, can you go grab one? Sorry, guys. She's gonna grab a Ziploc bag for me. So if there are any questions, you can go ahead and unmute and I can answer them now. But basically, if you add cornstarch to the garden store silicone that you get, the silicone will set up a lot faster, and you actually make a putty-like material, which is actually really nice for making a nice thick silicone mold. So a little cooking show magic here. Here's one that I made earlier of the same form, and it's nice and thick, and it's an opaque color because I made the putty-like form from it. When Heidi's back and can switch the cameras, I'll do a little detail of it, but it's a nice way to thicken up your silicone mold without it taking forever to set up. And you'll see it sets up really quickly, sometimes even before I can get it all out of the bag. So I'm just going to put some silicone into the corner of this Ziploc bag. You don't need to use a Ziploc bag, but it makes it a lot less messy. If you do it outside of some sort of container, this cornstarch gets everywhere, and it's just not very pleasant. So I'm just going to put some into the corner of the Ziploc bag. And then for about this much, can we go to the up? This much silicone, I'm going to add about a tablespoon of cornstarch, but really it's going to be about feel and making sure that it just gets to the right consistency. If you add too much, it'll get too thick and kind of grainy. So it's better to add a little bit at a time and then add more as needed. So I'm just going to add about a tablespoon. Sorry for those of you on the metric system. Seal that up, and then I'm just going to knead it, making sure that it gets nice and incorporated. And I want it to be a putty-like consistency when it's all done. It will also go opaque or like a translucent color, more so than it normally is. So that's also a way to tell when it's ready. And the other way to tell is to just cut it open and see if it's sticking to your hands. If it's sticking to your hands, you need a little bit more cornstarch, because the cornstarch will also help with the sticking. So I'm going to add a tiny bit more because it's still not quite there. The vinegar smell is really intense right now. Seal that back up. Go ahead and start kneading that together. Pushing it, always pushing it to the corner of the bag so that we can get it out. And what we're going to do is cut the corner of the bag so that it works like a pastry bag. Just working to the corner and kneading it together. Making sure that that cornstarch is all in there. Go ahead and cut the corner. I'm going to just soap my hands so that they definitely doesn't stick to them. And then I can squirt it out. And you can tell it's more of like a putty like consistency. And jewelers actually will use this to, like, if you want to make a mold of a cabochon or something like that, you can smush this onto things and get like a mold of a button or something like that. And they actually sell silicone putty that you can buy. It's stupid expensive when it's basically just cornstarch mixed with silicone. And you can color this. If you add some food coloring to your cornstarch, you can make it different colors. So it's pretty, but it's just a little bit, you can make this mold thicker and it'll set up, as opposed to this method, the soapy water method, where if it gets too thick, it'll take forever to set up. This, I can go ahead and just pour on, just dump on a bunch of it. And it's not going to really stick to anything, and I can make it a lot thicker. I found that it doesn't get as great a detail, so I tend to start my first layer with the soapy water method, and then I'll thicken it up using this cornstarch method. But again, I'm just sort of patting it to smooth it out and spread it out. But I'm not as concerned about it being too thick with this method. And the cornstarch aids, I'm not exactly sure what's happening chemically in it, but it does cause the silicone to set up a lot faster. My assumption is that it's pulling some of the moisture out of the material, but I'm not entirely sure. If anybody knows what's happening, feel free to share. But a lot of soap makers or candle makers will make quick molds this way, also jewelers. But it's a nice way to make kind of more of a putty-like material that will set up super fast. One thing to do when you're making a mold like this, even if you're just doing a brush on, or if you're doing it this way, is to make sure there's an area where the area where you're going to cut the mold open so you can get your object out of it, that it's nice and thick. So I tend to bead up a long path along here and make sure that's nice and thick. And that's where I'm going to cut, because you want to make sure that when you cut your mold open, that thick area will come together and seal together seamlessly, so you don't get any material leaking out, or the mold doesn't quite meet up again exactly the way you want it. So you can see I've sort of created a little ridge there, which is going to be my cut line. And that's where, once everything all sets up, I'll cut that mold open and open it. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more here. And you can interchange between the two different styles of mold making. So if I just need to thicken up a tiny little area, I can go ahead and add a little bit more silicone to my water. I've made a huge mess here. And again, start patting that on just like we did before. And I just keep adding layers until I get to a nice thickness that it's going to all hold together. With the core casting process, the more time you spend kind of on setup and planning things out, the more successful you're going to be. It just takes a little time to kind of get these initial steps going. If you had a big object that you wanted to core form, and you wanted a hollow core, you could take that mold and slush cast the wax into it, just make a thin shell of wax and make a core that way. The only issue with that is that it's hard to tell that your thickness is uniform. Doing it this way, where you pre-make the core, you can ensure that your casting is going to be uniformly thick, especially if you're really going for a thin-walled vessel or something like that. Something like Joanna's pear and bottle, of course, she just had a bigger circular mold and then the pear could sit down inside of it. But anything where your glass is sort of conforming to the shape of your core, you want to make sure that it's as uniformly thick as possible so that your core doesn't look off center or you end up with an area that doesn't actually fill. Excuse me. So doing it this way, where you're pre-casting the core, making it in advance, and then adding the wax around it or adding a bigger mold around that, so you can get in there and really see that it's uniformly thick, you'll have a lot more success. All right. So again, I just keep adding layers until it gets to a nice thickness that's usable for me and that I can pour the wax into. I'm just going to keep adding that. One thing that you can do with these molds is add an extra layer that acts as a locking mechanism, which I like to do, especially for these thin molds that I can't necessarily wrap things around. So one thing you can do is add a little flap to these so that it locks together a little bit better. And to do that, I just use a little bit of petroleum jelly because the silicone won't stick to it. And I put that on one side of that ridge that I made. So not both sides, just one side of it. So that side has no petroleum jelly. This side does. And I've colored this with food coloring so I can see it a little bit better. The woman who taught me this little trick would use a stick of lipstick, but lipstick's expensive. I went to go buy some and I was like, whoa, I'm just gonna get some Vaseline. It's much cheaper. So putting that on one side of it, then I can add in my last layer. And go right over the top of the petroleum jelly. First on the one side with no petroleum jelly, then right over the top of the area with the petroleum jelly. Covering that all up. And I can see the petroleum jelly, the Vaseline through there, especially since I colored it. That's why you want to color it, so you actually know where it's at. And that'll give you a good sense of where to cut your mold open. Set this aside. And if we go to the cooking show, it's done. Here's our mold. We've added, you can see where the petroleum jelly was right there. And then all I did was cut next to that petroleum jelly to open it up because it's not going to stick right there. I could pull this flap back that's created because of that petroleum jelly where the silicone didn't stick, pull that back, and then cut through my thickened line. And then what that does is create a little locking mechanism. So now the mold doesn't fall apart. So here's that flap that I just created. There's my thicker cut line right in there. I'm sorry this is clear. I wish this is a different color. It's kind of hard to see. But this is the thickened line, and then open it up, and there is my interior of the mold there. So all that does is it makes sure that it locks together so you're not messing with rubber bands and pins and all these kind of business like that. It just all locks together itself and you don't need to mess around with anything else.